the final point I want to make in today's lecture is knowing our perspective, knowing how we're going to approach this, I think, really important topic of Alaska Native cultures. And so, first of all, you might have noticed that this course is an anthropology class, in which case, depending on whether or not you've ever taken one, you might be saying, what the heck is anthropology? It's not a super well-known field. Anthropology is one of the social sciences, so it's one of the fields of study like psychology or like sociology that studies human beings. Anthropology is kind of unique in the sense that whereas, political science mainly looks at politics, economics mainly looks at, the economy, anthropology kind of looks at all of these different parts of a culture and a society holistically, looking at all these different parts of what it means to be a human being, and especially what it means to be a human being in a specific time and place and culture. It also tends to take a very comparative approach, meaning we don't just look at human beings living in certain, let's say in the United States or something like that. We look across all time and all space, so we want to look at all the different cultures around the world, even within a nation, all the different cultures within that nation, and also look across time, right? Which is why there's things like archaeology to look at cultures of the past. Anthropology also tends to be focused a lot on context. Context. What do things mean in context? And especially one aspect of that is what we sometimes call cultural relativism, which means basically that we want to understand what the practices or the beliefs of a group of people mean to them in context of their own history, their own culture, right? Now, what does it mean to me? What does it mean to them? What do they think of when they think of this ceremony or this practice? And then anthropology tends to have both an Edic and an emic side, which is a fancy way of saying it has both an outsider and an insider viewpoints, because anthropologists very often interview, speak to, consider the viewpoint of, learn from the insider viewpoints of the people in that culture, but then an anthropologist may or may not be from that culture, and often an anthropologist might be from outside this culture and kind of bringing that dynamic to it as well. And I think there's value to both outsider and insider viewpoints. Anthropology as a social science also tends to be really grounded, and what I mean by that is even though it's asking really big questions like what does it mean to be a human being, and why do humans act the way they do, and why do they think the way they do, we tend to look at that really big question through really, really specific things, like really specific studies. Like, for example, my research that I did for several years had a lot to do with how do Navajo people speak about a specific sacred mountain that was under threat from a ski resort, and how did they ally with different environmental groups. Now, the types of research anthropology does tends to fall into 4 different fields, what is called cultural anthropology, archaeology, linguistic anthropology, and then physical anthropology. So cultural anthropology tends to do ethnographic research, although there's other types of research as well. But for us, we're interested in present-day cultures, and so usually what that looks like is spending a lot of time in a community and then doing interviews with the people in that community, surveys, and also just kind of observing their way of life and taking part in their way of life, kind of getting so involved in a community that you can then start speaking intelligently about who these people are and what their way of life is. And sometimes we call that fieldwork as well as participant observation. So some of what you will be reading, quite a bit of what you'll be reading this semester, if it's not from a native author, it is very often from an anthropologist who spent significant amounts of time living in that community, or at least communicating with that community. This is the type of research that I typically do as a cultural anthropologist. We'll also read some things that were written by archaeologists, and archaeological research is not Indiana Jones. He would have been a terrible archaeologist. It's basically excavating and then analyzing material artifacts, the buildings, the trash, the tools, all the kinds of material stuff, the physical objects that a group of people have left behind. Linguistic research, we might read 1 or 2 things from linguistic anthropologists. That type of research is sort of recording and analyzing how a group of people speaks and communicates, signs, rites, etc. And then physical anthropology research tends to be, we won't do a lot of that in this class. It will come up a couple of times with physical anthropology. I don't know that we're actually going to read anything by a physical anthropologist, but learning about people by learning about their bodies, both past and present. So sometimes these would be the kinds of anthropologists that are analyzing things like skeletal remains, which has its own controversies behind it, which will probably come up later in the course. Now, so that's kind of the discipline I'm from, is anthropology, and it's also sort of it's the sort of department that this course is partially housed in. But even though it's in theory an anthropology course, we're actually going to be drawing on a lot of different kinds of disciplines. There will be people writing that we're going to be reading that are historians and people writing that are politicians within Native American communities, and there will be anthropologists, and there will be all sorts of different fields that we're drawing on, but anthropology is definitely going to be a part of that. And so on that note, anthropology and indigenous people in Alaska as well as elsewhere, there's a complex relationship there. Historically, it's sometimes been a painful relationship in the sense that especially early anthropologists engaged in practices that were not always ethical and were not always respectful. Present day, at present, and I'm kind of speaking present day, meaning post-1980, I would say anthropology with indigenous people in Alaska as well as elsewhere has tended to be a lot more collaborative, kind of working with and sometimes on behalf of Native groups. And that's not always the case. It is much more often the case now. And indeed, you now have a decent number of people that are themselves from Alaska Native communities who are themselves anthropologists, and you read one of them in the most recent reading. As far as, I think, anthropology, when we're talking about Native studies and Native cultures, I think there's things it can bring to the table and things it can't. I think there's a degree to which an anthropologist, unless they're from the community, which sometimes they are, but unless they're from the community, I think there's only so much that an anthropologist can understand about a community, as would be true of any community that we're part of, right? The people in it probably have kind of the best, most in-depth understanding. At the same time, there's something unique that an anthropologist can bring because they are trained as social scientists to look for certain kinds of patterns and trends, to ask certain kinds of questions, to use certain kinds of data, and they can sometimes bring kind of an educated outsider scientific perspective that I think can complement and add to what people from the community are saying. So again, in this class we draw on anthropology, but other sources as well. And if I was, on that note, since we're talking about sources, if I were to say to you, well, hey, go learn about Alaska Native people, there's a lot of sources you could go turn to, right? You could Google and find all sorts of different documents from all sorts of different people and groups. And so in this class, we'll draw on lots of different kinds of sources, and it might be useful to you, and this is part of what we're doing in this course, not just as you're studying Alaska Natives, but in general, as you try to understand different cultures. It's useful to kind of think through what are the different types of data and information you can use, and how are they reliable or how are they not reliable. So for example, in this course, sometimes we'll be drawing on historical documents, things that were written, for example, during the colonization period of Alaska by Euro-American settlers, Russian settlers, etc. Some of the strengths of that kind of those documents is a lot of times it's sort of like things that were written right during that time period and very detailed. Some of the limitations include that a lot of times these colonizing groups, the explorers, different things, they were often unfamiliar with the cultures, just encountering them, sometimes negatively prejudiced against them, and so there's sometimes things in those records that aren't entirely accurate or aren't very scientific, like they're making guesses about what the population was that aren't maybe well substantiated in some cases. We'll draw sometimes on oral history, so verbal stories taught within Alaska Native traditions. And one of, I think, the huge strengths there of oral history, which actually is sometimes written history as well, but tribal histories, is that it's spoken in the words of the people from that community. It oftentimes includes details that the, let's say, early Euro-American explorers left out. It brings a native perspective, and it often brings millennia of knowledge, right? People that have been talking about and remembering things that happened in their communities for centuries, if not millennia. Some of the limitations of that, and I guess limitations might be the wrong word here. It's just, any source of information has kind of things that it's really good at and maybe things where it has to be supplemented by other sources depending on what kinds of questions we're asking. So with oral history, one of the things is that it may not always be dated in the same way that it would be dated in sort of a written history book. It may be. Sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't. Sometimes you have references to time that are things like, well, since time immemorial, right? Since the beginning of our community, which works very well for a story about our origins as a community, but may be hard for, let's say, an archaeologist trying to figure out, well, when specifically did this group start living in this area? So there's sometimes those kind of ontological differences. Oral histories, where I have done a lot of research in, for example, the American Southwest, sometimes also you run into that there may be ways of explaining events that don't kind of jive with Western academics in the sense of like, well, stories that involve deities or supernatural beings. I don't think that's necessarily a weakness. I think that's potentially a strength, right? And it's something that gives meaning and worldview, but it is a difference, let's say. where you have to think about, well, how do we reconcile the archaeological record with the oral history record? Or do we have to reconcile them? Maybe we just acknowledge that they're two different ways of talking about history, and they both have some validity and strength. There's ethnographic and linguistic data. So that's usually things some of the reports will read, and I'll try to indicate when this is the case, but I may not always, but it's reports that have been written by anthropologists, oftentimes outsider anthropologists, but who spent significant amounts of time in a community. Some of the strengths is it's going to bring sort of an anthropological perspective, a comparative perspective that's informed by not just that community, but by the wealth of knowledge anthropologists have from looking at lots of cultures. At the same time, there's a limit to how well an outsider can get to know a culture, even if they've researched a lot, I think. There's a degree to which you got to live it to fully know certain aspects of it. And sometimes there's aspects of a community that they may not want to share with outsiders, so there may be things in these articles that are left out. We'll draw sometimes on archaeological data and physical anthropology data, so where the past has been analyzed through physical remains. And I think there's some real huge strengths of that as far as we have kind of a window to things that happened centuries or even millennia ago. But it's really good at certain things. I would say the archaeological record can be really solid at teaching us things like how was a group of people hunting. We can get really precise about what kinds of things they were hunting based off the bones and remains we find. What kinds of technology, what kinds of settlement patterns. On the other hand, some things just don't really show up in the archaeological record, and because they've disappeared, so certain types of material people use, or because nobody necessarily wrote them down, so things like religious beliefs might be really hard to interpret from, well, we excavated a house, but we don't know what their belief system was, which are sometimes really important aspects, and that's where sometimes it's really helpful to supplement archaeology with actually talking to the descendants of these communities and saying, well, what do the stories say about how your ancestors thought about the world? Some things don't show up in the record. Sometimes there's a lot of sites which we haven't excavated. There's some sites that we probably shouldn't excavate. There's ethical issues with excavation that have to be talked through. And I think archaeology does a better job of dealing with those issues than it did 100 years ago. But that's something that we always have to be thinking of. And then finally, there's, and I think, frankly, this is kind of the best of these 5 types of sources, although they're all can be good in different ways, but is, kind of going to the source itself and looking at what present-day Native Alaskan authors and leaders and scholars are writing, their words, whether that's online, whether that's in print or verbal. In the day of Google, there's really no excuse, right? A lot of Alaska Native corporations and tribal groups have websites where they talk about their own history and culture, at least in brief. And so these can be really valuable to hear directly from the source, in the terms of the speaker. Of course, like any other viewpoint, it's not perfect, right? It can always be further enriched by other sources. And so I think there's actually value in using all of these types of sources rather than just one. If I had to say, one source is best, I suppose it would be talking to contemporary people from those communities. But I think all those kinds of sources have value and add to our kind of overall picture of Alaska Native lifeways in the past and Alaska Native lifeways now. And you kind of see that whole, all sorts of different perspectives are useful approach in terms of your readings. The Roderick book that you have was Native and non-Native authors kind of tackling some really common questions that Alaskans ask about Alaska Native issues. The Williams book is primarily Native authors, although a few non-Native anthropologists and things. And then the Blackboard readings are kind of a hodgepodge, a lot of it from anthropologists, but also some from news stories, right? Kind of contemporary going-ons. And you might ask, are there unreliable or limited sources? And this will be kind of relevant when you're doing a research project to not rely too much on unreliable sources. A lot of times things you find on the internet might be very, very reliable, might be written from folks in the community or scholars or just some rando who has opinions and heard something. There's sometimes things that we say about tribes or about Native groups which might be really reliable or might not, right? So you might have heard, tribal groups get free healthcare. That's a really inaccurate description of what actually happens. What people are usually talking about is tribal health clinics, which are typically very often funded by a tribe itself. And so that would be a little bit like saying that if you have health insurance through your employer, you have, quote, free healthcare. You definitely don't have free healthcare. You have healthcare that's part of your relationship with your employer. So people sometimes say things about Native people that aren't really very accurate. TV, internet, movies, same thing, can be accurate, can be inaccurate. So be aware of your sources, use critical thinking, and in this class we'll try to use reliable sources.